the conclusion of the third hearing of the January 6th Select Committee, incredibly dramatic new information about what was going on with the vice president and the president, their interactions when the vice president was taken down to that secure location, how he refused to get into his motorcade, refused to get into his car because he said to the Secret Service, I respect you, I trust you, but you're the one behind the wheel. I will not leave, basically saying he would not leave the Capitol facility. He wanted to complete his job, which was not completed until 3:23 a.m. He was in that secure location for 4.5 hours. And most memorably, the way Greg Jacob and Judge Ludick, but particularly Greg Jacob, his White House counsel, ended with prayer in that secure location, saying he pulled out his Bible and he read from Daniel 6. That Daniel had become the commander of Babylon and refused an order from the king. This after incredible 2 days, summarizing several days and weeks, but 2 days of intense conversations between the vice president and the president, the vice president's lawyers and John Eastman, and back and forth, but refusing to go along with his direct order from President Trump, even though his life was in danger, and he had come within 40 feet of the mob when he was being escorted down to that underground location. Hallie?
Some of the contours of what we have heard in the testimony and in the hearings today had been previously reported at various points over the last year and a half. But to hear it, just like in the previous hearings, to hear it from the mouths of the people who were directly there, right, from people like Greg Jacob, Mark Short in tape deposition, for example, of how this went down, how they describe these interactions, these moments. Eric Hirschman, for example, too, was striking. What we heard from John Eastman, or should I say what we did not hear, him pleading the fifth something like 100 times, according to the committee. We're going to talk more about that in a second. And then, Katie, what I think is important for people to take away from this, which is what Judge Ludick got to at the end, the idea that this is not isolated to 2020 in his view, right? This isn't a backwards looking. This isn't just a backwards looking record of history. It is very much forward looking, based on the fact that former President Trump may very well run again in 2024, is already previewing these arguments of almost preemptive election fraud, if you will, after these lies about what happened in the 2020 election, Katie.
And we can talk about some of the people that won primaries last night who might be in charge of elections. One of the other things that stood out to me, not just how close we came to almost essentially losing our democracy, but how close we came to losing some of our lawmakers and our elected officials. They talked about how there was a confidential informant within the Proud Boys who told the FBI that the Proud Boys would have killed Mike Pence had they gotten a hold of him. They would have killed Nancy Pelosi had they gotten a hold of her. And we saw from the graphics that they put up there just how close the rioters got to Mike Pence, within 40 feet. And Congressman Aguilar, you can see it right here, telling Mr. Jacobs, the White House lawyer, that that was about the same distance between the two of them during that hearing. Pretty close, just 40 feet. Let's go back to NBC News Capitol Hill correspondent Ali Vitale. So, Ali, the second half of this presentation today is certainly more compelling than the first.
Yeah, I mean, the pace clearly picked up there, Katie, in part because it was much more of a story of what was happening on January 6th. And look, the first part of it was always meant to establish, in what we now know was painstaking and frankly weedsy detail, of what the legal arguments were inside the White House, each one with Eastman coming back to the vice president's team saying, can you do this? They say no. Can you do this instead? They say no. We watched that ping pong go back and forth as the vice president's team and frankly the vice president himself held fast. But I think that for the second part of that hearing, perhaps the most compelling part of it was when they showed those never before seen pictures of what the former vice president was doing in those 4 hours that he was in a secure location. You even see from people like Greg Jacobs saying that most of the team had actually gotten in the car themselves when the Secret Service said that they had to go. But for Pence, everyone in the room, maybe they weren't paying attention, maybe they were kind of zoning out, they really tuned back in, eyes glued to that screen as they looked at what the former vice president was doing on that day in those critical hours. I think that might have been their most compelling piece in a second half that really was much more effective than the first.
And Allie, let's bring back our panel, MSNBC Chief Legal Correspondent Ari Melber, Chuck Rosenberg, former U.S. Attorney and former senior FBI official, Joyce Vance, former U.S. Attorney, and Frank Magluzzi, former FBI Assistant Director for Counterintelligence, and Michael Steele, former chair of the Republican National Committee. I'm so struck to all of you. I'm so struck by the fact that there are legal ramifications, huge legal ramifications here, John Eastman wanting a pardon, all the rest of it, but also political ramifications about 2024. And Frank Magluzzi, let's talk about Mike Pence and the way this committee, which has been described and demeaned as being political by its critics in the Republican Party and by former President Trump, ended up praising Vice President Pence, a very likely candidate for at least the Republican nomination.
Indeed, law and politics have mixed again today in a very big way. Again, we've heard from conservatives, Republicans, respected judge today telling us that he sees a clear and present danger if Trump were to get into power again. That is a very specific legal test. That language isn't something he's making up. It comes from Schenck versus United States. It's a two-part test. It's a test to determine both intent to engage in criminality and that the intent it's so imminent that it will result in criminality. It's a danger kind of a test. He's telling us, federal judge, clear and present danger has great meaning to him. So politically, for conservatives to hear this today and to understand the prayerfulness with which Vice President Pence saw his actions, the loyalty to God and Constitution today for Pence and those around him, really powerful, powerful stuff.
I should note, by the way, we mentioned earlier this afternoon that Mike Pence was in Ohio today for what was a kind of split-screen moment. He did not talk about anything related to January 6th. You see the former vice president there. Chuck Rosenberg, let me go to you with something that Andrea referenced, and this extraordinary revelation that the architect of, in many ways, this scheme to attempt to overturn the legitimate 2020 election results, John Eastman, in the days after January 6th, wrote to Rudy Giuliani and said, "I've decided that I should be on the pardon list if that is still in the works." We know this is somebody who pled the fifth, according to the committee, something like 100 times. Chuck, what is the legal exposure for John Eastman now, in your view? Any legal liability on his part here?
Potentially, yes, absolutely, Hallie. I mean, he knew that the theory he was propounding, that a vice president had the authority to reject the electors or send it back to the states. Eastman knew, and we learned that today, that was false, phony, fraudulent. Eastman conceded that he would have lost in the Supreme Court 9-0. Eastman allowed that he didn't believe that authority would have extended to Al Gore in 2000 or to Kamala Harris in the next election in 2024. So Eastman knew it was fraudulent, and yet he urged it on the President of the United States. And it resulted, as we know all too well, in this insurrection at the Capitol. Can I just add one point? Because I think it's important. We see now that even if there are people we disagree with, and on politics or policy, that they're principled, right? We'd have a tendency to demonize folks we disagree with. But Mr. Short, Mr. Hirschman, Judge Luttig, Mr. Jacob, Vice President Pence, whatever our policy and political differences with them may be, they are principled people who acted in a principled way when we needed it most.
So, Ari Melber, the DOJ is requesting documents, all of the transcripts from these hearings. They want to get everything. And I'm struck by something that they're probably going to want, which is the correspondence between Greg Jacob and John Eastman talking on the day of the insurrection. Did you advise the president that in your professional judgment, the vice president does not have the power to decide things unilaterally? Also, and thanks to your BS, I won't say the word, we are now under siege. John Eastman's response is that he did advise him and that Donald Trump, once he decides something, I'm paraphrasing, it's hard to get him to let go of it. Talking about John Eastman's exposure, I mean, he clearly knew. He said he was probably should be on the pardon list.
I think you and Andrea both speaking to this coming out of the hearing. We've got two smoking guns, and they both came in part two of the hearing. Could they have come earlier is an organizational question. The smoking guns are, you kept plotting to overthrow the government even after a violent insurrection. You didn't view that as somehow bad, illegal, or a chance to reset. You soldiered on because you saw these as your fellow soldiers. Number one, against Eastman. Number two, who knows everything John Eastman did? John Eastman. And with that knowledge, while he had a buddy still in the White House who he tried to keep in the White House and turn into a dictator, he still wanted a pardon for crimes. Why does John Eastman think he needs a pardon for crimes? Because John Eastman thinks he committed crimes. Very bad. The last point I'll make, because I know we have a lot of panelists here, just picking up on our coverage, this hearing today was interesting in that it started very slow. It started with the less damning information. It felt like it started as a constitutional law seminar, but it ended as a very obvious episode of Law and Order. Who did it? Donald Trump. Who was his accomplice? John Eastman. Who thinks they did crimes? John Eastman.
And Ari, I know you've got to go to do your own show. We'll be watching at 6 o'clock Eastern. Michael Steele, let's talk about the ramifications of this. There are a lot of legal ramifications, clearly. But what about the politics of this, in that Mike Pence is portrayed as someone who stood up to the President of the United States, and that Donald Trump was not only aware that it was wrong, but said, you know, wouldn't it be cool to have that kind of power? And that John Eastman actually said, well, you know, once he gets something in his head, you can't talk him out of it, although John Eastman had put the incorrect theories in his head.
Yeah, I'm not going to get in the way of all these smart lawyers on this panel. I'm just going to get into the down and dirty of the politics here, because it is ugly as hell for Republicans who came out on January 7th, 8th, 9th, 10th and said the right thing because it was the right thing. They knew instinctively, they knew in reality that Donald Trump was wrong in his behavior and the execution of that behavior relative to January 6th. And to then, after that, double back, double round, and double down on defending him, excusing it, ignoring it, nothing more than just, you know, some walk through the Congress, some type of, you know, political discourse, a misunderstanding. All of that politically in the face of this very damning evidence, to Ari's last point, is going to have a real political blowback potentially on Republicans. It'll be interesting to see how they dance on that pinhead over the next few weeks.
Joyce, we have about 25 seconds left, and I'm sorry to do that to you, but I want to get you into the conversation here, so let me turn the floor to you.
Well, something powerful that we saw today that we should look for in the future as we turn our attention to whether DOJ will prosecute is the very powerful way that the committee juxtaposed the president's tweets after he'd been told that the plan was illegal and rioters were storming the Capitol. And he continued to target Mike Pence. It's tough to walk that back. You've got the tweets and then the videotape of the rioters talking about their desire to hang Mike Pence. That becomes powerful indication that Trump was willing to use force. Force is the key element in proving insurrection or seditious conspiracy. Where this leads, we don't know for sure yet, but it's a hint of what the evidence could look like.